Hey everyone, this is Nick and I just came back home from my holiday. I'm a bit sunburned and a bit woozy from the flight home, but I'm not about to let you go through a full week without your healthy dose of Linux and open source news. So this week we have people from KDE, from Debian and from GNOME pushing for funding for Flathub to add payment support in the App Store. We have proof that most corporate companies are using open source software very wrong, and we have the unfortunate demise of the HP Dev 1 and probably the end of HP's Linux efforts. So let's look at that, let's look at the other news, and let's look at this segue to today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by TuxCare, and you probably already know about AlmaLinux, the replacement to CentOS. It's free of charge, it's managed by the community, and it's backed financially by TuxCare. Well, if you plan to run AlmaLinux in production environments, or if you already do, now you can get commercial support from TuxCare as well. With AlmaCare, you get 16 years of support for AlmaLinux, with security updates and new hardware support, so your fleet is more stable, maintenance costs are reduced, and your hardware can be used longer. You will also get a dedicated repo for all AlmaLinux packages, so you get updates faster. It also includes live patching support, so you can keep your kernel up to date without rebooting your systems and with zero downtime. And of course you get commercial support for a wide range of packages like Ansible, Kubernetes, MariaDB and MySQL, containers and more. Basically, if you want to deploy AlmaLinux in commercial production environments, you need AlmaCare, and you can learn all about it by clicking the link in the description. There's a proposal being made for Flathub to add payments, donations and subscription options to the platform. It's been submitted by Robert McQueen, the CEO of EndlessOS and the president of the GNOME board, but it also seems to be endorsed by people from KDE, GNOME and Debian as well. This proposal seeks to get appropriate funding from the Plaintext Group, an initiative developed by Schmidt Futures, founded by the ex-CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt. They're seeking $100,000 to fund the work. And the rationale here is to help remove the barriers for open source application funding by adding easier ways for people to contribute to the applications that they use. The proposal has been here a while, dating back to November 2022, and accepted for consideration in the Plaintext Group's GitHub repository. Now, Flathub is already moving towards that goal, as they're working to add donations and payments on Flathub through Stripe. And they're also working on a way for developers to verify that they own the apps they publish, so users know they would be contributing to the official project and not to any third-party package. And of course, you will always get some people clamoring against such a move, because there's always been that notion that going commercial is bad somehow. But here we're talking about Flathub, a community-controlled non-profit, not about a corporate entity seeking to profit off of open source work. And personally, I am all for it if I could have a simple way to donate to GIMP, to LibreOffice, to every single app that I use through the App Store without having to use 10 different payment platforms or support platforms or donation platforms. I would absolutely do it, especially if it comes with a list of all the apps I already bought on Flathub on any other distro, so I can reinstall them in one click. That would be great. But more generally, it would also mean that it's way easier for app developers to gather a little bit of money to fund the continued work on those applications, and it might also attract other developers for applications that are commercial and sold and just cannot really be distributed that well on Linux right now. Looks like companies are using open source software wrong, as recent research showed that 84% of commercial and proprietary codebases show at least one known open source vulnerability. 48% of these codebases also showed a high-risk vulnerability, staying unpatched. In the 2023 edition of Synopsys' Open Source Security and Risk Analysis, they based themselves on audits of codebases involved in mergers and acquisitions for a total of almost 1,500 codebases that they looked at for vulnerabilities and open source licensing compliance. The number of open source vulnerabilities apparently rose by 4% since 2021, and free and open source code is literally everywhere, making up to 73% of the total code for companies in aerospace, aviation, automotive, or transportation. And 63% of that code contained vulnerabilities. And do know that this isn't because open source code is insecure. 91% of the code bases had vulnerabilities because they used outdated versions of open source components, with patches available but unapplied. Apparently, this is because most teams might think that upgrading to a newer version would take too much time or create other problems, and so they prefer leaving a vulnerability in instead of actually updating the various free and open source components that they use. A strategy that is generally not the good one, but a very common one, as anyone who worked in web dev or just development in general can attest to. Try to take a full development sprint just to work on maintenance, upgrading components, and removing technological debt. No one's ever gonna grant you that in most companies. You might remember the HP Dev 1, a pretty great laptop made in collaboration with HP and System76, running Pop! OS out of the box, with hardware picked and tuned specifically to run Linux, and even some work being upstreamed in AMD drivers and the Linux kernel. I reviewed it and found it a great option for people who want the ThinkPad experience without getting a ThinkPad itself and its questionable approach to design. Well, it looks like ThinkPad owners will be able to just laugh and keep their laptops as HP canned the project. The HP Dev 1 is now discontinued and will not see a second iteration, although at least the company will support existing models all the way through January 2026, or at least 3 years from the purchase date. It seems obvious now why the product failed, only being sold with a QWERTY keyboard and only being sold in the US, never seeing a release for any other country. Now, they also never really advertised it, it was never really on their own website, and they kept it so close to the ThinkPad template that probably the only real target was US ThinkPad users, which will always prefer using a ThinkPad. Still, it's sad to see HP fail to put enough backing behind the product, as Dell, for example, has been selling their XPS line with Linux pre-installed for about 10 years now, and they seem to do alright with these devices. It really shows that a company needs to put its full backing and needs to commit to a product if they want it to succeed. Now, they probably will just think, no one wants Linux, but they just didn't want that product where you sold it, how you sold it. That's it. If people don't know it exists, it's just never gonna sell. And it sucks, because the people I talked to at the time at System76 and HP were very enthusiastic and very proud of the device. And yeah, I just guess corporate was not having any of it and just wanted to take zero risks whatsoever. With the release of the Linux Kernel 6.2 and the included support for M1 chips from Apple, many people, myself included, started seeing a future where any distro would run perfectly on these shiny new Apple devices. But it looks like that celebration was premature, as the developers from Asahi Linux explained in a long thread on Twitter and Mastodon. The gist of it is that support for the main chip is just the start, and that many other components of these devices still don't have mainline support in the Linux kernel. For example, all the input devices, like the touchpad and the keyboards, aren't functional yet, and to even have a useful system with an M1 Mac, you would need a kernel compiled with a 16K page size, which most distros do not do right now if they even have an ARM build. They still said that their goal is indeed to have all that work upstreamed in the kernel when it's ready, and to have all distros working well out of the box with the mainline kernel. But for now, and for the foreseeable future, you will need to run Asahi, or at least their kernel, to have a usable system. They're also apparently working with certain distros already to help them ship ARM builds that run well on these new Macs, and they will have something to announce in the near future. In the meantime, mea culpa for being too enthusiastic about this last week. Now, still, the Asahi team is doing excellent work, and the way they've been able to just reverse engineer everything on these laptops up to beta quality in just 2 years is very, very nice. Now, in GNOME land this week, there's some good news about the GNOME Circle program reaching its 50th accepted app. Now, as a reminder, Circle is a program that showcases apps designed for GNOME and that follow all interface, design, and accessibility guidelines of the project. It's basically a list of all the unofficial, non-core GNOME apps that will still look perfectly right on your GNOME desktop. Recently added apps include Chess Clock, Komiku, which is a manga reader, or Eyedropper, a color picker and color palette generator. Other apps with cool updates include PineTab Backup, now letting you enable presets to exclude folders from your backups, and adding excluding rules based on regular expressions, plus the ability to manually delete certain archives and more automated help to mount USB drives and use them as backup devices. GJS, the JavaScript engine that powers GNOME Shell and various GNOME apps, also received some work with new methods and more integration with glib, so developers have access to more power with that engine. GNOME Boxes got a new virtual machine creation dialog that's simpler and more in line with GNOME's human interface guidelines. GNOME Builder can now start an application with the GTK inspector active, and also got a revamped messages panel to make troubleshooting your app easier. Elastic, a graphical editor to tweak the parameters of GTK4 and libadwaita animations inside of applications, is also now available on Flathub. And Bottles got a new update as well, with a revamped new bottle interface and various UI and icon changes to make the app easier to use and understand. A lot of other applications also made progress, like Denaro, the personal finance manager, Fractal, the matrix client, login manager settings, tube converter, and more. It really seems that every week there are new GNOME apps and the existing ones are getting better and better, so either the GNOME team is getting better at compiling all the progress reports from developers, or there is just a lot of interest in developing GNOME applications. I don't think I've seen that app ecosystem being so alive. The Pine64 is already planning a revision of their PineTab. The second model will embark either 4 gigs of RAM and 64 gigs of eMMC storage, or 8 gigs of RAM and 128 gigs of storage, still eMMC. It's priced higher than the previous model, with the entry-level one going for $159 and the larger capacity one costing $209, compared to the $99 price tag of the original. All versions do include a detachable keyboard for that price though, so it still looks like a decent deal. The CPU will be a Rockchip RK3566, compared to the Allwinner 64 in the first model, which means each of the 4 GPU cores now goes up to 1.8 GHz, and the Mali GPU also got a noticeable bump. But it still won't be a speed demon by any means, as with most Pine64 products. It will still sport a 10.1-inch IPS touchscreen, but it will move to a USB 3 Type-C port on top of a USB 2 Type-C, compared to the original's USB 2 Type-A and micro USB. It will still be user serviceable, and of course it will run Linux, apparently with an Arch Linux build for ARM and KDE out of the box. They will be available to order in April unless something goes wrong. And as with all Pine64 devices, they are more meant for developers to have a good solid hardware base to start developing their applications on ARM or on touchscreens or smartphones than for the general public. But enthusiasts can still buy them and have a nice shiny little toy that they can bring with them. And seeing that most Linux tablet projects seem to fail or falter, with the latest one, the PineTab, seemingly being dead in the water with no one getting confirmation for pre-orders or anything, then maybe it's better to rely on an underpowered device made by a company that's actually known to deliver the products that they announced. And let's finish this with the gaming news. As Wayland slowly becomes the default on multiple distributions, and most of the work of the main desktop environments is done to support Wayland, there's one last holdout, which is gaming. Currently, every game ran with Proton or Wine runs an X server on top of Wayland, with the performance penalty it implies. This might finally change though, as the Wayland driver for Wine is getting closer. There's a new merge request that would mean the first parts of that support could make it into Wine, namely the Wayland driver itself, and it will also prepare the build tools to handle Wayland protocol files. It is definitely not ready yet, but the second part will include basic display support, so it could move fast once the first parts are accepted. And this would probably mean higher gaming performance as well, not just on Wayland specifically, but also compared to X.org, as Wayland compositors tend to use newer APIs much better and be way faster to draw things on screen. The Steam Deck has now passed 8,000 games supported on the device, with almost 3,000 verified titles that should run without any issues, and about 5,000 playable titles that will also run very well but might not be perfectly suited to a small display or a controller. The The number of new titles being added to the list doesn't seem to really stall or slow down, which is good, although as time goes by, more games are put in the playable category than in the verified one. Still, the Steam Deck is truly a little marvel, and I can't wait to see where they're taking that product line next, because it seems to have sold very well, so I would be surprised if there wasn't a revision in the future, maybe with a more powerful AMD CPU that might also be more battery efficient. And with 8,000 games, it's probably now the handheld console that got the most games ever in the entire world, which is pretty cool. Pretty cool, like this segue to today's sponsor. If you're due for a computer replacement and your plan is to run Linux on it, you should probably stop looking at Windows devices and trying to make Linux work on it, and you should probably just buy any computer from Tuxedo, which are designed specifically to run Linux. They are based in Germany, but they ship to most countries in the world, and they have a big range of devices that should have something for every need and for every price point, whether you need a laptop, a desktop, a simple, stable, affordable one, or a very powerful tower or laptop. They have everything. All their devices have a lot of customization options to really tailor it to your needs, and they're also all upgradable and repairable, including the battery, the SSD, and the RAM. So, if you need a new computer, you want to support Linux's development, and you want to run Linux on your device, buy something that was made to run Linux from the link in the description below. They're really good. So, thanks everyone for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't hesitate to like, to subscribe, to turn on notifications, to write a comment. And if you didn't like the video, well, that's not possible, but if you didn't, you can always dislike it and tell me why in the comments. And if you really enjoy the channel and you want to support what I do, there are plenty of links down there for YouTube memberships, Patreon, PayPal, and whatever else, super thanks or whatever is on YouTube. You can click them to see if you want to help support what I do. So, thanks everyone for watching, and I guess you'll see me in the next one. Bye!